when a shot rang out from a sniper across the river. Lieutenant Gerald Nealon, an Irish Catholic, fell dead. Elsewhere in the city, his younger brother Anthony was fighting on the rebel side.
The majority of the dead of Easter week were civilians, killed in the rain of shells and bullets that devastated the city centre in the British counterattack. Pearse and Connolly finally abandoned their headquarters at the GPO, surrendering on April 29th.
As the rebels were led into captivity, they were jeered and jostled by the crowd. Many of the most vociferous were women whose husbands were away fighting on the Western Front. The rising had been crushed, and public opinion now seemed set against the rebels. Until the British made a grave miscalculation.
The leaders were brought here to Kilmainham Jail in Dublin and hastily court-martialed and sentenced to death.
Over a period of 2 weeks, 14 men were executed here. 13 at this end, including Patrick Pearse, and up here, James Connolly, who had to be carried to his execution on a stretcher. The manner of their deaths and the number of executions would turn these men from being the leaders of a militant minority into martyrs who could be acclaimed by all of nationalist Ireland.
The poet William Butler Yeats sensed the impact of the executions. I write it out in a verse: MacDonagh and MacBride, and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Public anger deepened following mass arrests and the imposition of martial law. Here in the military archives in Dublin is a trove of witness accounts from young men who were radicalised by the events of Easter 1916 and who joined the volunteers in its wake. Matthew Davis from Roscommon. In 1916, he says, I was unattached to any group. After the rebellion, there was an outcry to execute the fanatics. I felt we would have to do something about it. And of course, he formed a volunteer unit in his area. The volunteers evolved into the Irish Republican Army, and among the young men who flocked to join them was my grandfather Paddy Hassett, the imperial policeman's son. Why would Paddy Hassett turn his back on that family tradition of service to the Empire? The biggest factor was what had happened in Ireland. The impact of the 1916 Rising and the executions and the roundups that took place after it. I sensed that that was what turned my grandfather and many, many other young men like him against the British. But if the great cause of the Irish Revolution had been a united republic, the consequence was very different.
I think after 1916, with the dead dedicated to a republic, the fires of Easter week have forged a new national identity, which is to be republican. Ulster Unionists find nothing in that whatsoever. They found little, if anything, in Home Rule. There's absolutely nothing for them in an Irish republic. It makes partition inevitable.
In the 1918 general election, Sinn Féin, led by veterans of the Rising, won a sweeping majority. But instead of going to Westminster, the party set up an Irish Republic. The Sinn Féin leader was Eamon de Valera, and his finance minister, Michael Collins. In an atmosphere made worse by renewed British threats of conscription, Collins would find himself directing a guerrilla war. The IRA campaign, which began in 1919, was met with fierce reprisals against civilians by security forces like the Black and Tans. A state-sanctioned policy of reprisal increased public support for the IRA. And Irishmen killed fellow Irishmen. Police shot IRA men and vice versa. This is my father's hometown of Listowel in County Kerry.
On the 20th of January 1921, an IRA squad was lying in wait at Church Street. The man they were going to attack, District Inspector Tobias O'Sullivan of the Royal Irish Constabulary, was coming up the street with his 5-year-old son. The IRA squad ran up to him and shot him dead in front of the child. Now, the version of the story that I was given growing up was that a British soldier, not an Irish policeman, had been killed, nor was there any mention that he'd been holding his child's hand when he was murdered. It was as if some parts of the story were simply too painful to tell.
O'Sullivan had taken part in a raid on a nearby village. After 2 years of violence, both sides declared themselves ready to talk. In October 1921, a Sinn Féin delegation led by Michael Collins arrived in London to discuss a political settlement.
Michael Collins arrived as the 20th century's first celebrity rebel, in terms of his public image, a kind of Che Guevara for his age. But here, Collins would encounter a British negotiating team led by Lloyd George that was both experienced and tough. Whatever else might be conceded, an Irish republic was not on offer.
26 counties of Southern Ireland would become the Irish Free State, with its own army, but swearing an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. The government had already allowed the 6 Protestant-dominated counties of Ulster to form a new state within the United Kingdom. But it wasn't Ulster that caused crisis for the Irish side. In Dublin, De Valera accused Collins of having agreed to the oath of allegiance without his consent. When the Dáil convened in Dublin in December 1921, De Valera denounced the oath of allegiance as an abandonment of the Republic. Collins argued that the treaty gave Ireland the freedom to achieve freedom. The one-time comrades became bitter enemies.
When the vote on the treaty came, it was perilously close. 64 votes for, 57 against. De Valera led his supporters out of the Dáil, and as they went, Michael Collins shouted, "Deserters all." The slide to civil war had begun.
A majority of the people supported the treaty, but couldn't stop a war characterised by extreme ruthlessness. Both sides committed atrocities. At Ballyseedy Cross in County Kerry, 9 Republican prisoners were tied to a log and blown to pieces by a landmine, retaliation for the killing of Free State soldiers. The government army gradually captured the Republican strongholds. But on the 22nd of August 1922, Michael Collins was assassinated in County Cork. The Free State would triumph, but his loss was devastating. In death, Collins would become a romantic icon, the great lost leader. Yet in some of his last writings, he espoused a patriotic pragmatism. True devotion, Collins wrote, lay not in melodramatic defiance or self-sacrifice, but in steady, earnest effort.
By the time the Civil War ended in 1923, Ireland was a very different country to the united and equal nation imagined by the revolutionaries of 1916. The revolution had driven the British out, but it had also consolidated the prevailing social reality. This was a Catholic, largely rural, and above all, conservative society.
It was a society not dissimilar to that imagined by Ireland's first political titans. The settled country, imagined by Daniel O'Connell, hero of Catholic emancipation in the 19th century. An Ireland of landowners, such as Charles Stewart Parnell envisioned, and which his Land League had done so much to create. A society whose fundamental desire now was for stability. In the Protestant-ruled 6 counties of Ulster, electoral boundaries had been drawn to ensure majorities for Unionists in most areas. There'd been fierce retribution against Catholics following IRA violence. More than 8,000 were driven from their jobs, hundreds were killed. The Prime Minister James Craig was a patrician landowner and proud Orangeman.
Catholic Northern Ireland, Catholic Ulster does not really feature in his political agenda. Craig, I think, associates Catholicism with a challenge to the state that he finds himself ruler of. He associates Catholicism with subversion. But unionism comes together from a variety of very different institutions and forces. It's absolutely not a monolithic group, and it contains a spectrum of those who are ferocious in their anti-Catholicism across towards a more liberal take on the union and unionism.
Across the river is Donegal in the south. This is Clady in County Tyrone, one of the 6 counties of the new Northern Ireland state. The Prime Minister, James Craig, had built here a Protestant state for a Protestant people. Many years later, a unionist leader trying to forge peace with nationalists would ruefully acknowledge that this had been a cold house for Catholics, a place of discrimination and exclusion.
Catholics materially were better off in Northern Ireland than they were in the Irish Free State. But politics matters more than economics. Catholics were not welcome, and that was clear. They had to listen to a tirade of abuse coming up to the 12th of July every year. They had to listen to unionist politicians boasting that they'd never employed a Catholic, never would employ a Catholic, wouldn't have one around the place. That sort of chilly feeling of not being wanted produces serious disaffection.
But in the south, the new government of Common na Gael, led by Michael Collins' heirs, had neither the military means, economic power, or desire to wage a war of territorial redemption. The south opted for stability. Even with the arrival in power in 1932 of Eamon de Valera, now leading the Fianna Fáil party, rhetoric would be a comforting substitute for action.
Ireland united, Ireland free, these are the ideals to which enthusiastic young Ireland is now devoting its energy.
Whatever the rhetoric, whatever the propaganda campaigns, de Valera realised that unification was not going to happen, and he may even have seen advantages in that. I think the majority of Southerners were quite happy that Northern Ireland was gone, that the wretched unionists were corralled in their area and were not coming down and not interfering with their setup in the south.
The founding father of Irish nationalism, Wolfe Tone, imagined a nation that united Catholic, Protestant and dissenter. But Ireland was now an island of 2 states in which religion would be a primary badge of identity.
Here at the Phoenix Park in 1932, vast crowds gathered for a religious festival that would symbolise the character of the new Irish state. Whatever rhetorical gestures might be made to the Protestants of Ulster, this was a Catholic nation.
The clergy, for somebody like de Valera, were very important. They were his advisors. The leaders also had brothers who were priests or nuns. That clerical establishment was very much integrated in a way that if you were a political leader, the likelihood is that you, if you're a Catholic, you would not be very distant from some